Less than 24 hours into the 30-hour ceasefire declared by Vladimir Putin, Russia and Ukraine have already traded blame over violations of the truce. Putin says Kyiv deployed dozens of drones overnight, while Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Moscow has not halted its shelling on the front line. Zelensky accused the Kremlin of creating a false appearance of honoring a truce and reiterated his offer to extend the agreement for 30 days starting midnight Sunday. Our international affairs commentator Doug Herbert joins me now on set. Doug, so both sides accusing each other as quickly as it started, it's as if the truce never really took effect.
Yeah, Jenny, look, I'm not going to say I told you so. Okay, I'll say I told you so, right? We essentially did say this yesterday. Look, there are few grounds objectively for being surprised at the current state of affair with the mutual finger pointing and the recrimination. Going into this, I said yesterday that this was essentially a propaganda tool, right? A unilateral declaration of a truce, of a ceasefire declared by Putin as a propaganda tool, essentially as information warfare to make himself look like the peacekeeper, to make Ukraine look like it is recalcitrant, putting the ball in Ukraine's court. Look, there was very little incentive already for Russia to modify its behavior, namely because the one interlocutor that Russia goes to, Donald Trump and his administration, has put almost zero pressure. Yes, there have been a few remarks about the U.S. losing patience. Russia should also make some gestures. But generally, the onus has been on Ukraine, on the one that was invaded. The aggressor has not had pressure exerted on it by the one interlocutor, the one power that really counts for Putin, that is the U.S. The U.S. has been much more favorable, much more cozy to Putin. So he's had already a very large, a lot of margin, wriggle room and margin for maneuver. A lot of people saying, oh, did Putin actually bend in declaring the ceasefire to Trump's pressure? I don't see it that way. That's not my take at all. I see this as just the opposite. Putin knows that he has essentially no real pressure being applied by the Trump administration. The Institute for the Study of War, people who are far more savvy than I am about warfare and tracking it, and have done so since the very beginning of this war, the battlefield movements, say that it appears that from the very outset of the opening minutes and hours of this ceasefire, I put ceasefire in quotes, yesterday, Russia appears to have continued its limited offensive operations and indiscriminate shelling across wide areas of the front line. In addition to that, Russia continues to reject, and we've said this time and again, Zelensky keeps saying he would like to extend this. He's ready. Is Russia ready to sign on to the 30-day ceasefire that Ukraine agreed to, that was hashed out by the U.S. and Ukraine last month? Says we're ready for that. Russia, Putin, and his other top officials have continued since March 13th, the day that joint U.S. and then Ukrainian proposal for a 30-day full ceasefire was declared. Since that time, Putin and his top officials have repeatedly continued to reject that proposal. So in many ways, when I say we should not be surprised at the state of affairs, in a sense, the headline itself was a false headline yesterday, even calling it a ceasefire in the first place.
Now, if we're being cynical, it was, a lot of noise for a 30-hour non-truce. So what was the point of declaring it in the first place?
For what I just said, the reason I just said, Vladimir Putin has never abandoned his root causes of this conflict. This gave him a sort of informational step up, a little notch up in the propaganda war. This puts Putin in a sort of pole position as, like I said, the peacemaker. He declares a unilateral truce on, quote, humanitarian considerations on the Easter weekend. He suddenly looks like the one full of goodwill, the one who wants to end this war, the one who wants to make peace. Like I said, it puts Ukraine once again, looks like Ukraine is on the back foot in a defensive posture. The ball then, in quotes, being in Ukraine's court to show that it too wants to make peace. It also wants to end this war. So it's a purely, as I see it, an informational propaganda gesture by Vladimir Putin to give him advantage in this war. What has he demanded all along in this war, and what are the demands that haven't changed? This is what we need to come back to all the time. When I was asked repeatedly yesterday on this very set, so is there a chance that this ceasefire, or whatever is left of it, will continue continue beyond midnight tonight? Is there a chance it might lead to something more endurable? Well, the reason I am skeptical, doesn't mean it can't happen, but the reason I remain very skeptical, you might even say cynical, is because Putin's root causes have not changed. They haven't bent. The root causes are the so-called denazification of Ukraine. That is code term for basically anyone who threatens Russian-speaking people or perceived as doing so in Ukraine. They have to be out of there. Change of regime in Ukraine, notably in Kiev. Zelensky out, a Russian proxy government in, hasn't been explicitly put in those terms. Some people have, but not Putin himself. But those are the basic demands. And NATO basically stepping back from its open door policy of allowing new members. None of these things have changed. Putin at this point has no incentive other than to undermine and create reasons to discredit Ukraine as all sides try to move forward in negotiations in a peace framework. There's nothing that gives you sort of optimism given the current set of circumstances. Nothing's changed in Putin's narrative, in his mind.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for that, Doug.